You are not tired because life is hard. You are tired because you have been carrying weight that was never yours to carry. Before the day even begins, the mind is already moving, replaying words, anticipating problems, holding on to things that do not belong in the present. And by the time anything real demands your energy, most of it is already gone, not spent on action, but on noise. The Stoics understood this long before modern life made it worse. Exhaustion is rarely caused by reality itself. It comes from constant attachment, unfiltered, automatic, and rarely questioned. Every opinion, every reaction, every imagined outcome begins to take up space. And over time, that space becomes weight. There is a quiet discipline in letting things pass, not because they are unimportant, but because they are not yours. Opinions, outcomes, reactions, expectations. Each one pulls your attention away from what you can actually control. Epictetus taught that freedom begins when you separate what is within your power from what is not. Most people live in reverse. They invest energy outward and lose control inward. And that is why life begins to feel heavier than it truly is. You wake up, and before anything happens externally, something has already started internally. A thought appears, quiet, almost unnoticed. Then another follows, and another, until the mind is no longer observing, it is reacting. It begins to replay something that was said. It stretches it, reshapes it, tries to extract meaning that may not even exist. A simple moment becomes layered, then heavy. You imagine what they meant, then what you should have said, then what might happen next. And all of this unfolds before the day has even begun. Nothing real is happening, yet your energy is already being spent as if it were. That is where control is lost, and it rarely feels like loss. It feels like thinking, like processing, like awareness. But there is a difference between awareness and entanglement. One observes, the other absorbs. And once the mind starts absorbing everything it touches, it stops distinguishing between what is real and what is constructed. The body is still, but the mind is already tired, not from effort, but from unnecessary movement. Marcus Aurelius once wrote, "You have power over your mind, not outside events." The idea is simple. Living it is not. Because the mind does not stay contained, it reaches outward, constantly attaching itself to things it cannot control, then reacting to them as if they were immediate problems. When attention is scattered, direction cannot remain stable. This is not philosophical, it is practical. If your focus shifts with every thought, every memory, every imagined outcome, your actions will follow. You start something, then drift. You decide, then hesitate. You move forward, then second guess. It begins to look like a lack of discipline, but it is not discipline, it is uncontrolled attention. And there is a quiet cost to this, not just exhaustion, but erosion. Clarity begins to fade. The mind becomes reactive instead of deliberate. It responds instead of choosing. Entire days pass without anything meaningful being built, not because there was no time, but because there was no sustained focus. Epictetus made this clear. Men are disturbed not by things, but by the views which they take of them. The disturbance does not come from the event. It comes from what you continue to do with it. The comment that lingers, the situation that replays, the imagined scenario that drains you. None of it exists anymore, but your engagement with it continues, and that is what keeps it alive. Once you begin to see this, something shifts. Slowly, you start to notice the moment a thought tries to pull you in, the moment your mind begins building something that is not actually happening. And in that moment, there is a choice, not to suppress it, not to fight it, but to not follow it. This is where control begins to return, not through force, but through restraint. The ability to see a thought without becoming it, to notice a pattern without continuing it, and the more this is practiced, the more space begins to open up. Space that was once filled with noise now holds clarity, And with that clarity, something else becomes possible: intentional movement. When your attention is no longer pulled in every direction, it can finally be directed. You start what you intend to start. You finish what you decide to finish. Not perfectly, but consistently. Not because the world has changed, but because your engagement with it has. It is easy to underestimate how much of life is shaped in these quiet moments. Before conversations, before responsibilities, before anything external demands your attention. Because if those moments are already filled with unnecessary weight, everything that follows is affected. But when they are clear, even slightly, the entire day shifts. This is not about eliminating thought. It is about choosing which thoughts deserve continuation. Not every mental movement requires your participation. And once you understand that, the mind begins to settle. Not into silence, but into order. And in that order, energy is preserved, not wasted on repetition, not drained by imagination, not scattered across things that do not matter. It becomes available again, for action, for focus, for direction. And that changes everything. If this way of thinking resonates, take a moment to subscribe, not just for more content, but as a decision to keep returning to clarity. Because the more you expose your mind to discipline instead of noise, the more control you begin to build, quietly, steadily, and on your own terms. Because when you begin the day without carrying everything from the past or anticipating everything in the future, you arrive in the present with something rare. Not just awareness, but control. The mind does not arrive in this state by accident. It learns slowly and quietly through repetition. Each reaction becomes a signal. Each moment of overinvestment becomes a form of instruction. When something small happens and you respond as if it were significant, the mind takes note. When you give attention to something that has no real consequence, the mind records it as important. Over time, these patterns build, not dramatically, but steadily, and what begins as occasional overreaction becomes a default way of operating. The mind stops asking whether something deserves attention. It assumes that it does. This is why it begins to treat everything with equal weight. A passing comment feels as heavy as a real problem. A minor inconvenience lingers as long as a meaningful setback. The scale is lost, and once that scale disappears, clarity follows. Because clarity depends on distinction. It depends on knowing what matters and what does not. Without that, everything blends together into a constant stream of urgency. Not real urgency, but perceived urgency. And the body responds to it the same way, with tension, with focus, with energy that is being pulled in too many directions at once. Seneca once wrote, "We suffer more often in imagination than in reality." That suffering is not always loud. It is not always dramatic. Most of the time it is quiet, subtle. A constant background pressure that never fully goes away. It comes from thinking about what might happen, replaying what already has, or attaching meaning to things that were neutral to begin with. And because it happens internally, it is rarely questioned. It feels like part of the process, part of being thoughtful, part of being aware. But in truth, it is often just noise that has been given too much importance. The mind, left without discipline, does not filter. It collects. It holds on to everything it encounters, especially what carries emotional charge. A look, a tone, a delay, a word choice. Each one becomes material for further thought, and the more it collects, the heavier it becomes. Not because the world is heavy, but because nothing is being released. Everything is stored, revisited, reanalyzed. And this creates a cycle where the past is never truly left behind, and the future is constantly being rehearsed. Carl Jung observed this pattern in a different way when he said, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate." That direction often feels invisible. It does not feel like control from within, but like pressure from outside. As if circumstances are shaping your experience, when in reality, it is your internal responses shaping your interpretation of those circumstances. The habit of overvaluing small things, of reacting automatically, of holding on to what should have passed. These are not isolated moments. They are patterns. And patterns, when left unexamined, become identity. But the shift does not come from forcing the mind into silence. That approach tends to create resistance rather than clarity. The more you try to suppress a thought, the more attention you give it. And attention, even in resistance, still feeds it. This is why Stoic discipline is not about shutting the mind down. It is about guiding it, teaching it what deserves engagement and what does not. Not through rules, but through repeated choice. Each moment offers that choice. A thought appears, and you decide whether to follow it. A reaction begins, and you decide whether to continue it. At first, this feels difficult, almost unnatural, because the habit has been built over time, and habits do not disappear instantly. But they can be interrupted, and each interruption weakens the pattern slightly. Each moment of non-reaction, each decision to not engage with something unnecessary, creates a small shift. Over time, those small shifts accumulate. The mind begins to change its expectations. It no longer assumes that every thought will be followed, every reaction will be completed. It starts to recognize that not everything requires participation, and with that recognition comes a new kind of space, not empty, but open. A space where thoughts can pass without being held, where reactions can arise without being acted on. This is where clarity begins to return. Not because more information is added, but because less interference is present. When the mind is not constantly occupied, it can finally see what is in front of it without distortion. It can assess situations without layering them with unnecessary meaning. It can focus without being pulled away. And that changes how you move through your day. Decisions become simpler, not because they are easy, but because they are no longer weighed down by irrelevant considerations. Actions become more direct, not because there is no hesitation, but because hesitation is no longer fueled by endless mental noise. There is a steadiness that begins to develop, a sense that your attention is no longer being taken from you, but directed by you. It is important to understand that this is not about becoming indifferent. It is not about caring less in a careless way. It is about caring with precision, giving your energy to what actually matters and refusing to spend it where it does not, because energy, once spent, does not return in the same form. It affects how you think, how you act, how you respond to everything that follows. When everything is treated as important, your energy is spread thin. But when you begin to choose, deliberately, what deserves your attention, that energy becomes concentrated. And concentrated energy creates impact. It allows you to engage fully with what matters, without being distracted by what does not. This is the quiet discipline that changes everything. Not a dramatic shift, not a sudden transformation, but a gradual reordering of how the mind operates. A movement away from automatic reaction and toward intentional response. And as that shift continues, the difference becomes noticeable, not just in how you think, but in how you experience everything around you. Because when the unnecessary is no longer carried, what remains becomes clear. There is a quiet habit that goes unnoticed because it feels intelligent, even responsible. It is the constant forming of opinions about everything that appears in front of you. A situation unfolds, and the mind reacts. A decision is made by someone else, and the mind evaluates it. A piece of news, a passing comment, a distant event. Each one invites judgment, and without hesitation, that invitation is accepted. It feels natural, it feels like awareness, but over time, something subtle begins to happen. The mind becomes crowded, not with what is necessary, but with what is irrelevant. This is where the misunderstanding begins. Many believe that having a stance on everything is a sign of awareness, of engagement with the world. But awareness does not require constant judgment. In fact, Excessive judgment often distorts awareness. It adds layers where none are needed. It turns observation into interpretation, and interpretation into attachment. And once attachment forms, the mind is no longer free to move. It becomes anchored to things that have no real connection to its path. Epictetus captured this idea with precision when he said, "If you want to improve, be content to be thought foolish and stupid." There is a quiet strength in that statement. It suggests that not engaging, not reacting, not forming an immediate opinion can appear as a lack of awareness to others. But in reality, it is discipline. It is the ability to resist the pull of unnecessary involvement, to let something pass without needing to define it. And that restraint preserves energy in a way that constant reaction never can. The mind, however, does not default to this restraint. It prefers engagement. It seeks stimulation, interpretation, meaning. It wants to categorize everything it encounters. And in doing so, it creates a continuous stream of internal activity. This is why it feels difficult to step back. Not because it is impossible, but because it goes against a pattern that has been reinforced repeatedly. Each opinion formed, each reaction completed, strengthens the habit. Over time, this habit creates a subtle but constant pressure. Not overwhelming, but persistent. The need to evaluate, to respond, to hold a position. And this pressure consumes energy, not in large bursts, but in small, continuous amounts. The kind that builds into fatigue without a clear source, because the mind is always engaged, always processing, always holding on to something that does not need to be held. Seneca once wrote, "It is not the man who has too little, but the man who craves more that is poor." This applies not only to material things, but to attention itself. The craving to engage with everything, to have an opinion on everything, creates a kind of mental excess, not of resources, but of involvement, and that excess becomes a burden, because the more you take on, the more you must carry. There is a different way of moving through this, not by withdrawing from the world, but by interacting with it differently, by recognizing that not everything requires a response, that some things can be seen without being judged, acknowledged without being analyzed. This is where neutrality begins to take form, not as indifference, but as clarity. The ability to see something as it is, without adding unnecessary meaning to it. Neutrality often gets misunderstood. It is seen as passive, as disengaged, as a lack of care. But in practice, it is one of the most efficient states the mind can operate in, because it allows movement without resistance. It allows observation without attachment. And in that state, attention remains available, not tied up in defending positions or revisiting judgments, but free to focus where it truly matters. This does not mean that opinions disappear entirely. There are moments that require them, situations that demand evaluation, decisions that depend on clear judgment. But the difference lies in selectivity, in choosing when to engage, rather than engaging with everything automatically. And that choice changes the entire experience of thinking. With that clarity, direction becomes easier to maintain, because attention is no longer divided. It is focused, and focused attention leads to consistent action. Not perfect, not effortless, but steady. And that steadiness creates progress in a way that scattered effort never can. It becomes clear then that the goal is not to eliminate thought, but to refine it, to reduce the unnecessary, to keep only what serves a purpose. And in doing so, the mind becomes lighter, not empty, but unburdened, capable of moving through situations without being pulled into each one. There is a quiet freedom in that, the ability to encounter something and let it pass, to see without needing to define, to remain unaffected by what does not belong to your path. And over time, this freedom becomes a kind of stability, not dependent on circumstances, but rooted in how you engage with them. Because when you stop carrying what is not yours, you begin to see clearly what is. There is a difference between feeling and carrying, and most people blur that line without noticing. Emotions arise naturally. They move through you, respond to situations, reflect what is happening in real time, but somewhere along the way, that natural process becomes extended. What should pass begins to stay. What should be observed begins to settle, and slowly, almost invisibly, you begin to carry more than you need to. Not because life demands it, but because you have become used to holding on to what was never meant to remain. It starts in small ways. Someone is tense, and you absorb that tension. A conversation shifts, and you carry it with you long after it ends. Something goes slightly wrong, and instead of adjusting and moving forward, it lingers in your mind, coloring everything that follows. None of these moments are significant on their own, but together they create a pattern, a steady accumulation of emotional weight that builds throughout the day, then carries into the next. This is where exhaustion begins to take shape. Not from physical effort, not from real challenges, but from the constant presence of unresolved emotional residue. It is subtle enough that it often goes unnoticed, but persistent enough that it cannot be ignored. You feel it in the way your thinking slows down, in the way your reactions become heavier, in the way even simple tasks start to feel more difficult than they should. And yet, when you look for the source, nothing seems large enough to justify it. Marcus Aurelius once wrote, "If you are distressed by anything external, the pain is not due to the thing itself, but to your estimate of it." That estimate is what turns a moment into a burden. It is what extends the lifespan of an emotion far beyond its natural duration. Because the event itself is brief. It happens, and then it is gone. But your interpretation of it, your continued engagement with it, that is what keeps it alive. And as long as it remains active in your mind, it continues to consume energy. The difficulty is not in recognizing this once it is pointed out. It is in noticing it while it is happening. Because the process feels automatic. A reaction occurs, and before you can observe it, you are already inside it, already thinking about it, already feeling it, already carrying it forward. And by the time you become aware of it, it has already taken root. This is why so many people believe that emotional weight is unavoidable, because they only see it after it has already been accepted. Seneca once observed, "We are more often frightened than hurt, and we suffer more from imagination than from reality." That suffering is not always dramatic. It is often quiet, internal, stretched over time. It is the result of continuing to engage with something that has already passed. And when you begin to see that, you also begin to see where your energy is being spent. The idea is not to become indifferent. That is a misunderstanding that often leads people away from this practice. Indifference suggests a lack of care, a disengagement from experience. But what is being developed here is not indifference, it is selectivity. The ability to feel without holding, to notice without carrying, to respond without extending the response unnecessarily. When you start to apply this, the change is not immediate, but it is noticeable. You begin to see how often emotions are picked up without question, how often you accept what is not yours. And once you see it, you can begin to interrupt it. Not perfectly, not every time, but enough to create a difference, enough to reduce the accumulation. And as that accumulation decreases, something else begins to emerge, a sense of lightness, not because nothing is happening, but because you are no longer adding to what is already there. Situations still arise. People still behave in ways you cannot control. Outcomes still shift. But your relationship to these things changes. You experience them, but you do not carry them forward in the same way. This changes how you move through your day. Reactions become shorter. Recovery becomes faster. The space between events and your response becomes clearer. And within that space, there is control. Not control over what happens, but over how long it stays with you. There is also a noticeable shift in how you think. When the mind is not weighed down by accumulated emotion, it becomes sharper, more focused, less reactive. Decisions are made with greater clarity, not because they are easier, but because they are not being filtered through layers of unnecessary feeling. Action becomes more direct. Movement becomes more consistent. Over time, this practice becomes less effortful. What once required conscious attention begins to feel natural. The mind starts to release things more easily. It no longer assumes that every emotion must be held, every reaction must be extended. It begins to trust that letting go is not a loss, but a form of efficiency. And this efficiency changes everything, because energy that was once spent on carrying is now available for doing, for focusing, for building. The difference is not always visible from the outside, but it is clear internally. There is less friction, less resistance, more flow between thought and action. It becomes clear then that emotional weight is not determined by the world, but by your interaction with it. Not by what happens, but by what you continue to hold. And once you begin to release what is unnecessary, you realize how much of that weight was optional all along. There is a quiet pattern that shapes most days, and it rarely comes from anything significant. It comes from small things, a short comment that lingers longer than it should, a delay that interrupts your rhythm, a minor inconvenience that shifts your mood just enough to affect what follows. None of these moments are large enough to define the day on their own, but they do not exist in isolation. Each one leaves a trace, and those traces begin to accumulate. What starts as a minor disruption becomes a series of interruptions, and those interruptions begin to fragment your focus. At first, it feels manageable. You notice the disruption, you react, and you move on. But the reaction does not always end when the moment passes. It carries forward. It stays in your thinking. It influences your next action. It colors your next interaction. And by the time another small disruption appears, your state has already shifted. Not dramatically, but enough that your response is slightly different, slightly heavier, slightly less focused. And this continues throughout the day. What makes this difficult to recognize is how insignificant each moment seems. None of them appear worthy of attention when viewed alone. But together, they form a pattern that shapes your experience more than any single major event. Because consistency, even in small things, has a compounding effect. And when that consistency is built on reaction rather than intention, it slowly pulls you away from what you were originally doing. Epictetus once said, "Don't demand that things happen as you wish, but wish that they happen as they do happen, and you will go on well." There is a kind of stability in that perspective. It does not remove disruption, but it removes the resistance to it. And resistance is what extends the impact of a small event. The delay itself is brief, the comment itself is momentary, but the resistance to it, the internal push against what has already occurred, that is what gives it duration. When you resist, you stay connected to the disruption. You replay it, you analyze it, you respond to it again internally, and in doing so, you keep it active. What could have been a passing moment becomes something that follows you, not because it needs to, but because you have given it continued attention. And attention, once given, tends to sustain whatever it is directed toward. Over time, this pattern creates a noticeable effect. You remain busy, constantly moving, constantly doing something. But at the end of the day, there is a sense that nothing meaningful has progressed. Not because there was no effort, but because the effort was divided, pulled in different directions by a series of small reactions, each one taking just enough focus to disrupt momentum, but not enough to seem significant on its own. Marcus Aurelius wrote, "The impediment to action advances action. What stands in the way becomes the way." That idea changes how disruption is viewed. Instead of seeing it as something that interrupts progress, it becomes something that can be absorbed into it. Not by forcing it to be useful, but by refusing to let it derail you. The disruption remains, but your response to it shifts. And that shift determines whether it becomes an obstacle or simply part of the process. This is where control begins to reappear. Not through eliminating what interrupts you, because that is not possible, but through stabilizing your response to it. When your state remains steady, the disruption loses its power to extend beyond its moment. It happens, it is acknowledged, and then it passes. It does not follow you into your next action. It does not alter your focus. It does not become something you carry. There is a difference between noticing something and being moved by it. Noticing is neutral. It allows you to see what is happening without becoming entangled in it. Being moved by it, on the other hand, shifts your internal state. It pulls your attention away, it alters your thinking, it changes how you act. And once that shift occurs, it takes time to return to where you were. That return is often overlooked. People tend to measure the cost of a disruption by how long it lasts in the moment, a few seconds, a few minutes. But the real cost is in the recovery, in the time it takes to regain focus, to rebuild momentum, to return to a state of clarity. And when disruptions happen repeatedly, that recovery process becomes continuous. You are always trying to get back to where you were, but never fully arriving. When you begin to see this clearly, the importance of your response becomes more apparent. Not in a dramatic way, but in a practical one. Each moment presents an opportunity to either extend the disruption or allow it to end. And that decision, though small, shapes everything that follows. Because your state determines your next action, and your next action determines your direction. This is not about becoming unaffected by everything. That is neither realistic nor necessary. It is about reducing the duration of your reaction, about allowing things to pass through your awareness without taking hold. And this is a skill that develops over time. With practice, you begin to notice the moment a reaction starts, the moment your attention begins to shift, and in that moment you can choose not to follow it further. As that choice becomes more consistent, the difference becomes noticeable. Your focus holds longer. Your actions become more continuous. The day feels less fragmented, less reactive, not because fewer things happen, but because fewer things are carried forward. And that creates a sense of flow that was previously interrupted. It becomes clear then that the goal is not to control what happens around you, but to stabilize what happens within you. Because when your internal state remains steady, external disruptions lose their ability to redirect you. They become part of the environment, not forces that dictate your movement. And in that steadiness, there is a quiet form of control, not forced, not rigid, but consistent, the kind that allows you to move through your day without being pulled in every direction, the kind that preserves your attention for what actually matters. And over time, that preservation becomes the difference between constant activity and meaningful progress. Decisions rarely arrive as complicated as they feel. At their core, most of them are simple: a direction to take, an action to begin, a step to commit to. But what makes them heavy is not the decision itself. It is everything that gathers around it. The imagined outcomes, the possible mistakes, the opinions of others, the fear of choosing incorrectly. These layers build quickly, often without being noticed. And before long, what was once a straightforward choice becomes something that feels difficult to move through. This is where hesitation begins, not because there is a lack of understanding, but because there is too much added weight. You are no longer deciding based on what is necessary. You are negotiating with possibilities that do not yet exist. Each imagined outcome introduces a new variable. Each variable demands consideration, and with each added layer, the decision becomes more complex, not in reality, but in perception. The mind begins to loop. It returns to the same possibilities, the same concerns, the same imagined consequences. Not because it is discovering something new, but because it is searching for certainty. And certainty in most decisions does not exist in advance. It is created through action, through movement, through engagement with reality. But as long as the mind remains in the loop, waiting for clarity to appear before acting, nothing changes. This is where the distinction becomes important. There is a difference between thoughtful decision-making and overinvestment. Thoughtful decision-making looks at what is relevant, considers what is within your control, and then moves forward. Overinvestment, on the other hand, attaches meaning to things that are outside of your control. It asks questions that cannot be answered in advance. It tries to solve outcomes before they have occurred, and in doing so, it creates a sense of difficulty that was not originally there. Marcus Aurelius approached decisions from a different place. He once wrote, "If it is not right, do not do it. If it is not true, do not say it." There is a simplicity in that approach. It reduces the decision to its essential elements. What is right? What is necessary? What aligns with your direction? Everything else becomes secondary, not ignored, but not allowed to take control of the process. When you begin to apply this, something shifts. The decision does not become easier in the sense that it requires less effort, but it becomes clearer. The unnecessary layers begin to fall away. The imagined consequences lose their influence, and what remains is the core of the choice itself. What needs to be done? What direction to take? What action to begin? This clarity does not remove uncertainty. It changes your relationship to it. Instead of trying to eliminate uncertainty before acting, you accept that it is part of the process. You move forward with what is known, and you adjust as new information appears. This creates a different kind of momentum, one that is not dependent on perfect conditions, but on consistent movement. There is a noticeable difference between those who operate this way and those who do not. It is not intelligence. It is not even experience. It is the ability to act without being held back by unnecessary attachment, to make a decision based on what is present rather than what is imagined, and to accept that progress comes from action, not from extended deliberation. When decisions are approached with this mindset, they begin to lose their weight. Not because they are less important, but because they are no longer burdened by everything that does not belong to them. The process becomes more direct, more focused, more aligned with reality rather than with projection. This also changes how you experience the outcome. When you are not attached to a specific result, you are able to respond to what actually happens rather than reacting to what you hoped would happen. This creates flexibility, the ability to adjust without losing direction, to continue moving without becoming stuck in what did not go as expected. Over time, this way of operating becomes more natural. The mind stops trying to control every possible outcome. It begins to trust the process of action and adjustment, and with that trust comes a sense of ease. Not because decisions are no longer important, but because they are no longer overwhelming. There is also a shift in how time is experienced. When you are no longer caught in extended loops of overthinking, decisions are made more quickly. Actions begin sooner. Progress becomes visible, and that visibility reinforces the process. It shows that movement, even imperfect movement, leads somewhere, while hesitation, no matter how well-intentioned, keeps you in place. It becomes clear then that the difficulty of decisions is often self-created, not intentionally, but through habit, through the accumulation of unnecessary considerations, through the attachment to outcomes that cannot be controlled. And once that is recognized, it can be changed. Not all at once and not perfectly, but gradually, one decision at a time, one moment of clarity replacing a moment of hesitation, one action taken instead of postponed. And with each of these shifts, the process becomes lighter, more direct, more aligned with what actually matters. Because in the end, decisions are not meant to be carried, they are meant to be made. There is a point where thinking stops being useful and starts becoming a barrier. It feels productive at first. You go over the situation, consider different angles, weigh the risks, imagine outcomes. It gives the impression of control, of preparation, of intelligence at work. But then something subtle happens. The thinking does not lead to action. It circles, it repeats, it returns to the same questions without producing new answers. And what began as clarity slowly turns into hesitation. This is where overthinking hides in plain sight. It does not feel like avoidance. It feels like effort, like responsibility, like taking things seriously. But the longer it continues, the more it reveals its true nature. Not progress, but delay. Not understanding, but the search for a level of certainty that cannot be reached through thought alone. Because thought by itself has limits. It can explore possibilities, but it cannot confirm them. It can imagine outcomes, but it cannot test them. Epictetus expressed this idea in a different form when he said, "Make the best use of what is in your power and take the rest as it happens." That distinction is often missed. What is in your power is action. What is not in your power is the outcome. But overthinking tries to reverse this. It tries to control the outcome through extended thought, while delaying the only part that can actually move things forward. And in doing so, it creates a sense of being stuck. The loop itself is predictable once you begin to see it clearly. A question arises. What if this goes wrong? The mind responds by analyzing. It considers possibilities, runs through scenarios, tries to anticipate every detail. But because the future is uncertain, the analysis never reaches a final answer. So the mind returns to the question again, hoping that another pass will produce something different. And each time it does, it reinforces the loop. Carl Jung once observed, "Thinking is difficult, that's why most people judge." But there is another side to that difficulty. When thinking becomes too prolonged, it stops being precise. It loses its direction. It becomes less about understanding and more about managing discomfort. The discomfort of uncertainty, of risk, of not knowing how things will unfold. And instead of moving through that discomfort, the mind stays with it, trying to resolve it internally. But resolution does not come from repetition. It comes from engagement with reality, from taking a step, observing the result, and adjusting accordingly. This is what the Stoics understood clearly. That action is not separate from thinking, but a continuation of it. That you do not wait until everything is clear to begin. You begin, and clarity develops through the process. There is a certain fear that keeps the loop active. The fear of making the wrong choice. The fear of regret. The fear of being judged. And these fears attach themselves to the decision, adding weight that does not belong to the action itself. Because most actions in isolation are simple, it is the meaning attached to them that makes them feel heavy. When you begin to separate these elements, something changes. You see that the decision does not require certainty. It requires movement. It requires a willingness to act with the information available, rather than waiting for information that may never come. And this shift reduces the need for extended analysis. Not because thinking is no longer valuable, but because it is no longer expected to provide guarantees. The longer the loop continues, the more energy it consumes. Not just mental energy, but emotional energy as well. The repeated consideration of risks, the constant evaluation of possibilities, the ongoing tension of not deciding, it creates a kind of fatigue, and this fatigue affects everything else. Your focus decreases, your motivation weakens, even simple tasks begin to feel more difficult. Breaking the loop does not require a dramatic shift. It begins with a small interruption, a moment where you recognize that you are not gaining new insight, but repeating old patterns. And in that moment, instead of continuing, you act. Not perfectly, not with complete confidence, but with enough clarity to move forward. And that action, however small, changes the pattern. Once action is taken, something new enters the process. Feedback, real information, not imagined, not projected, but observed. and that feedback provides more clarity than any amount of internal analysis could. It shows what works, what does not, what needs to change. And with that, the need for speculation decreases. Over time, this changes your relationship with thinking itself. It becomes more focused, more intentional. You think to understand what is necessary, not to eliminate all uncertainty. You think to prepare for action, not to delay it. And this makes thinking more effective, not less. There is also a shift in how you experience uncertainty. It no longer feels like something that must be resolved before you can move. It becomes something you move with, a part of the process rather than an obstacle to it. And this reduces the pressure that often leads to overthinking in the first place. As this becomes more familiar, the loop loses its strength. It may still appear, but it does not hold you in the same way. You recognize it sooner, you interrupt it earlier, and you return to action more quickly. Not because the situation has changed, but because your approach to it has. It becomes clear that overthinking is not a sign of depth, but of hesitation. A hesitation that has been extended through repetition. And once that is understood, it can be reduced. Not by forcing the mind to stop, but by giving it a different direction. One that leads outward, into action, rather than inward, into endless loops. Because in the end, clarity is not found by thinking longer, it is found by moving forward. Control was never about the world becoming easier. It was about you becoming steadier. When the noise fades, when the weight drops, when the need for everything to go your way disappears, something powerful remains: clarity. And from that clarity, every step becomes more direct, more intentional, more yours. If this shifted something in you, don't let it end here. There's another video on your screen that will take this even deeper. Watch it while this mindset is still fresh.
आधा डोंगर आधा बोले आड्या ओपन में हम तो देख रहे आधे बुलिया भी ले लियो देख ये बुलिया बुलिया दिख रहा है मस्त लागे 8 मिनट 9 मिनट की तो है कि यार एक तो 3 मिनट की बना लो एक 9 मिनट की और एक डेली बना ली बुले बुले मस्त 2x में बना ली 2x में
वो हटाना वो कहीं आ रही हो
लाइन बंद कर रहा है कि ना या 10 की वो पता नहीं बना गया या पूरा डोंगर दिखाओ
देख लिया सही अर्ली सही आ रही
हाथ लड़ा दे दक्कन के गुर्दे को अभी भी चालू रहेगी बस
वो तो बाप का